Do you feel the vibes?
So today, I'd like to talk about something which I think is really going to have a profound impact on the world, and probably as importantly, what you guys are all about to, embark on, and that's this notion that we're entering what we would call the beginnings of an internet of value. So obviously, we've had an internet of data for the last 20 years. It's fundamentally changed our world, certainly changed everything that we've been a part of here. I think equally as exciting is what we're about to enter. This is in some ways, it's like we were talking earlier, this is like 1994 in terms of the beginning of this new internet, but an internet for moving value, not just data. And they're two completely different things. And so I'll spend some time talking about what that means. I'll show you a little bit about what we're working on specifically. And then I'd like to point out a couple of kind of fundamental things that are kind of resulting from that. So as mentioned, I've been involved over the last 20 years now in 3 Fintech ventures, beginning with eLoan back in the first .com wave. Then we also did Prosper and Ripple. That's been, a lot of ups and downs along the way, but really a fascinating time. But I would say nothing compared to what we're journeying into now. All these Fintech companies we've seen so far were built in sort of a pre-internet of value world. And now we're entering this sort of post-internet of value world. So I think what we're going to see is, the same kind of Cambrian explosion of new businesses that popped up once the internet got going. I think that's exactly what we're going to see in fintech. So I think we haven't seen anything yet compared to what's coming. And obviously the first 2 companies we were involved with were consumer. We were trying to disrupt the banks. We're much more interested now in building that infrastructure that's going to enable this internet of value. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means with Ripple. And sometimes it seems more boring, but I think it's going to be much more impactful, actually, given what we're about to enter. So this notion of an internet of value, I think there's a lot of parallels on how the internet of data built out that we can learn from and we're going to actually copy. There's also some things that are fundamentally different between an internet of value and an internet of data. And one of them is kind of a quote you guys may have seen from our friend Marc Andreessen, who's a wonderful guy. I love Marc to death. But you may have seen this. He talks about, hey, software is going to eat the world. And it's talked about like, gee, that must be a good thing. We're going to, the world's going to be eaten. Everybody's going to be disrupted. Awesome. This is actually one of the things I think that really has to change when we're talking about an internet of value. This sort of very chest-pounding sort of disruption is a great thing all the time. This is sort of an occupational hazard of living out here. Sometimes I joke, this is the kind of thing you say when you're drunk and not wearing pants. But really, this is just not a constructive way of building companies. And I hope we can all kind of learn from that and change up, because when we talk about fintech, we need a big tent for fintech. When you look at what has to happen here, there are so many different types of people, so many different domains that have to work together here, or we're going to have no impact. So the entrepreneurs need to work with the regulators, the consumer groups, and most importantly, we have to work with the banks, particularly in these early days of this internet of value. The banks are the networks of value on Earth today. There's just, it's equivalent to the way we all had to get, libraries and universities and research institutes. They were the custodians of data. We needed to connect them first before you could get a functioning internet. And that's kind of exactly what we need to do with this internet of value. We've got to get the existing networks of value, the owners of those networks, working together so we can build that foundation. So that needs more diplomacy than it does disruption. If we're going to have impact, we all have to sort of work together. So we like to think of businesses today, startup todays, try to think yourselves as builders, not disruptors. And I think that's particularly important in the world that we're going into. So I think it's actually a bright future. That's why we show this. But the Internet of Value, I think, is more than just laying out kind of a new way of doing finance. I think fundamentally, this represents the final step in globalization. And we're at a very interesting time right now with globalization. The world has never been more interconnected, more dependent on each other. We have got to work together as one world. It's also never been sort of more divided, and there's never been more disillusionment around what globalization means. And I think that's fair. People should be disillusioned with globalization, but not because it's a bad idea. It's more, it's a work in progress. It's incomplete. There is something missing with globalization. And we like to use the analogy of fire. You cannot have fire without fuel, oxygen, and heat. And I think the same thing applies with globalization. Globalization does not work unless you have interoperability between three things: data, goods, and money. And the truth is, we only have interoperability in two of those things. Goods and data are fully interoperable around the world. Money is not. So in some ways, we sort of have a fire without fuel. It's sort of the smoldering thing. We know there's potential there, but it really isn't delivering on all the promise. And probably, I think, safe to argue, it's actually making things quite a bit worse. An incomplete globalized system, kind of, if you're in a developing market, maybe if you're in a, kind of underserved market, you see all the data through your social media feeds. You have access to all this information and what other people are doing in their lives. But because the money part is not interoperable, you can't act on it. There's tons of parts of our planet where you can see, but you can't act. And that's a big problem. So, we look kind of like, how do we get here? Look at all these components of globalization coming back. This is a pretty recent thing. If you look at goods, for example, if you look at shipping, and we're just going back to the 50s, before the shipping container, so called pre-container. The 50s weren't that long ago, from my perspective. I know it seems like prehistoric times for you guys, but things have moved very rapidly. If you look at shipping before the shipping container, shipping was an incredibly inefficient activity. It was extremely labor intensive. Goods would show up in a port. They'd have to be unpacked. They had to be repacked. This was an incredible sort of friction point or burden on global trade. And then along comes a very, very simple innovation, a very simple technology, nothing super complicated, very, very basic, low level, called the shipping container in about the 50s. And that fundamentally changed the way goods and shipping worked. In the next 20 years, you had about a 700% increase in global trade. And why is that? That's because now goods were completely interoperable around the world. You could go from ship to train to truck without having to touch anything. Every port in the world was interoperable. You didn't need bilateral agreements to ship goods. Shipping companies were interoperable. So again, it fundamentally changed the way goods worked. Goods are now globalized. We all know what happened with data. Before the World Wide Web, it was incredibly expensive to communicate or send data cross-network. So that was a huge point of friction on how the world communicated. Obviously, with the World Wide Web now, 3 billion people can communicate without being on the same network. That's really the key point there. We have a network of networks when it comes to data and communications, fundamentally changed the way communications work. But that's not the case with money. Money is sort of that missing ingredient. With money today, the world spends about $2 trillion a year just to move value between networks or cross-border. And even spending that much money, we have missing access is blocked to billions of people. And you have incredible fail rates. So single-digit failure rates on cross-border value transfer. Single digit. In tech world, you talk about 5 non-reliabilities. That's expected. When it comes to cross-border transfers of value, you're talking 1/9. So that is incredibly expensive for the world. This is a huge burden. And again, that's why globalization is probably not working for most people. And it's why, if you look at how this is all working today, even a wealthy European can't send, even 50 euros cross-border without it all being chewed up in fees. let alone the people in developing markets that, according to the Gates Foundation, they need to be able to send 50 cents cross-border if they're really going to be full economic citizens. That's impacting about 2 billion people in the world. Let alone this sort of emerging Internet of Things, where what we're going to be seeing is, by 2020, 50 billion devices that are not just going to be exchanging data, but are actually going to be exchanging value, just like all your devices sitting here right now are exchanging data. As we sit here, that's what we should expect with machine-to-machine payments. So I would argue machine-to-machine payments will actually dominate value transfer on Earth if we get the right infrastructure. But that can't happen today, right? This needs the ability to send 1/100th of a penny, 1,000th of a euro, and you just can't do that cross-border in today's world. Okay, but there is light on the horizon here. We have new technologies that are showing great promise, and obviously one of the big themes, I know you guys talk about this a lot, and this is in the press every single day, and I don't know if it's the most overhyped category of technology, but it's probably a contender. Blockchain technologies, obviously a fascinating technology. It is ingenious. It's a game changer for sure. And what is it? It's a novel way of recording transactions that makes them immutable. These are basically distributed or decentralized databases where multiple copies of that database are kept all over the world. No one party that uses the database can change the database unless you have consensus with all the other people that are using it. Definitely very novel, very interesting, will have some applications. However, at the end of the day, a blockchain is nothing more than another network. So it does not solve this problem of interoperability or this need to have a network of networks for value. In fact, it's just adding to the burden of that need, right? These are just additional networks. They'll need to be interoperable. Bitcoin will need to be interoperable with Venmo or with HSBCs, core ledgers. That problem cannot be solved by blockchains. And we think this is the critical need in fintech because, again, this will set a new platform for this, again, Cambrian explosion of new startups. So while blockchain is not the answer, we do think it has set off kind of an unstoppable movement. It's attracted so much attention, brain power, and capital. And now you're seeing kind of second generation applications of not just blockchain, but I think more broadly what you'd call distributed financial technologies. One of the ones we're most excited about that we do think can solve this interoperability problem or become this sort of network of networks is something called the InterLedger Protocol, or ILP. And we think that can solve that problem of how do you enable sort of a network of networks to allow value to be instantly transferred between two networks or multiple hop networks, just the way the internet has fundamentally changed data. And I'll talk about this a little bit further, but we think this is really the game changer that brings us to that sort of idea of a grand network of networks where you have goods, data, and money all interoperable globally. And I think now we're off to the races on making globalization work, and including those 2 billion people that are now kind of off the grid. They now become full economic actors, or full citizens in the global economy, and that those devices actually become full economic actors as well. So you now can have devices that are buying, selling, paying taxes. This will have all kinds of implications. You could argue that Japan will be the most populous country on Earth in terms of economic actors, since they probably are building most of the devices and robots that will actually be exchanging value. That really changes the game on how the world's going to work. So again, we think this is all about then head down. Let's start building. Let's kind of knock off all the disruption talk that is really actually holding things back. I would argue that some of the early Bitcoin discussions around, hey, we're going to kill the banks and we're going to take everything over, have been a major setback in this sort of fintech wave, and we need to get off this kind of adolescent, chest-pounding, arrogant, Trump-like attitude about how innovation works. So we got to get down to building. With that, then let me show you a little bit about what we're building at Ripple. This is about a 2.5-minute video with audio that kind of explains what we're trying to do. I should point out, though, that, again, this is aimed at banks. Again, we think creating interoperability between banks is the key step in how we create this Internet of Value. Again, we were talking earlier, this is like 1994 all over again, and we're really just laying the infrastructure. So we got to get the banks on board. This is to a bank audience, so there'll be some weird terminology in here. And it's also specifically cross-border or cross-network. Cross-border, cross-network, really kind of the same ideas. So here we go, and then I'll go from here. Hopefully this will work. Yeah.
How Ripple works. Let's look at the inner workings of Ripple's solution and how it improves cross-border payments. In this example, two banks use a correspondent bank to route their payments. The Ripple solution includes Ripple Connect, which is used to coordinate information exchange between the banks. And the ILP ledger uses the InterLedger Protocol to coordinate funds movement between institutions to settle the payment. The solution ingests existing message formats like SwiftFin or ISO 20022 through a translation layer such as CGI's Intelligent Gateway or Volante's Volpay. Let's follow one payment through the entire payment flow. First, the translation layer parses the message and collects necessary information to initiate the payment. Here you see that Alice in the US wants to send money to Bob in Germany. She wants Bob to receive 500 euros. Ripple Connect communicates with the correspondent and beneficiary banks to obtain their payment processing fees and total cost. Next, pre-transaction validation takes place. This includes compliance screening and account verification checks. Since all banks have the necessary facts, they can pre-validate the payment even before funds move to ensure high straight-through processing rates. Now it's time to coordinate funds flow across the private ILP ledgers of these three different institutions. In this example, the originating bank has a Nostro account with the correspondent bank, and the beneficiary bank is using a third-party liquidity provider to connect in with the correspondent bank. To begin the settlement process, Ripple coordinates a hold on the funds across all three ledgers. The ILP ledgers generate cryptographic signatures to verify that the funds are committed to the transaction. Then, the funds are simultaneously released across the three ledgers. This process ensures no settlement risk. The payment either executes or fails. Upon completion, Ripple provides a confirmation message to all counterparties. The entire payment process across multiple banks takes seconds and provides end-to-end visibility into the transaction while increasing processing rates and lowering operational costs. Join the global real-time settlement network today at ripple.com/contact.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot of very specific bank-like, language there, but this is aimed specifically at sort of the transaction banking parts of banks, the part of the bank that would be involved in cross-border payment and settlement. I would argue, again, that's the biggest pain point, a huge problem, multiple billions of dollars that are spent that needs to be solved, and we think again, quote unquote, blockchain technology will have the biggest impact initially. Let me kind of distill down a couple of points here, though, that I think are most important. So what's really going on there? One of the big changes that's going to occur with this Internet of Value is that value transfer across networks is going to move from being a sequential process like it is today, and which is a huge problem, to becoming more of a coordinated, synchronized process. So a sequential process is just that. We've probably all seen this when you're trying to send money overseas from your bank. It's left your bank account, but you're calling your recipient, and it's like days go by and they don't have it. Like, where is it? Well, your bank probably doesn't even know because it's gone from their ledger or their network to some intermediate ledger to some other intermediate ledger that they may not even know about. And this could be literally 4 or 5 hops. And so why is that a problem? Obviously, that's a huge time delay. Time is money. More importantly, though, that is settlement risk. So there are too many states that can happen there. It could either go, it could not go, or it could be somewhere stuck in the middle. That is a huge, huge problem. So that settlement risk is really what drives up costs, and then that makes small payments that you might need from the underbanked or from devices or just from everybody unprofitable and not possible. What we change then is we turn that into a coordinated, synchronized approach, so that no matter how many hops are involved, no matter how many nodes have to be hit, they're all cryptographically being verified at the same time. So there is no settlement risk. There's only two states that can happen in that kind of a model. It's called an atomic transaction. It either goes or it doesn't go. Atomic is kind of the key word there, and that's sort of the way the internet works, if you will. The other kind of big thing that's changing, of course, is that we're modeling this after the architecture of the internet. And you think about what does the internet really mean? It's internetworking. That just simply means you have the ability for networks to communicate with each other. So kind of a network of networks. And that's a very different model than what you have today. If you look at the way the internet architecture works, at the bottom you have whatever network it is, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, whatever. And at the top you have whatever application is trying to be used, right? So the key thing is any application can be used on any network. How does that happen? It's because in the middle you've got obviously IP, and you have some transfer layers, but most importantly you have this internet protocol which allows that. And that's what you're doing now to money. So when we talk about ledgers are really just value networks, right? So the idea here is whatever the ledger is, and here I just have 3 examples of distributed ledgers, but that could certainly be HSBC's ledger, Citibank's ledger, Venmo's ledger. Everybody, any payment company has a ledger that holds state, and then of course any application should be able to run on any network. That's not the way it works today. Every application needs to be built on every single network independently and differently. And that's a huge problem. So ILP, the InterLedger Protocol, is analogous to IP Internet Protocol. And again, what you're really trying to do is, if I want to send you an email, I don't have to ask you, well, are you on Verizon, or are you on AT&T, or who's your provider? I just need your address, and I can send it anywhere in the world. That's not the way it works with money. If you say, hey, send me $10, well, are you on Venmo, or are you on PayPal, or are you Visa? So that's what you're trying to solve fundamentally. And again, Venmo does not interoperate. It's great, but it doesn't interoperate with other networks like 10Pay, for example. So this is the problem we're really trying to solve, and this is really fundamentally what changes. And what's interesting here is I think the way companies compete is going to fundamentally change like it did with the internet. If you look at payment companies today, what do they advertise? They advertise reach. So Visa, they're everywhere you want to be. Well, actually, they're only cover about 15% of the world, right? It's not everywhere. But that's what everybody's competing on. And that used to be the way information networks worked as well. If you look at some of the old advertisements, nobody in this room remembers this company, right? CompuServe, what do they use to advertise? We've got the most members, we're the biggest, we have the most services. And obviously the internet changed all that, right? The internet commoditized reach. So now whether you're a big company or a small company, everybody has the same reach. So that means you compete on other things. And if you look at the communication companies today, they don't mention reach. What they mention is speed or service, or most importantly, price, ease of use. This is super, super important when it comes to serving the underbanked, for example. In many countries around the world, you might have a single payment provider. They're the only ones with reach in that market. And because of that, they can be sloppy on everything else. So they can be super expensive, terrible service, and this is really holding back the world. Once reach is commoditized through, of course, IP and data, and ILP and value, now whatever market in the world now has the entire world's companies competing because everybody has the same reach. That's a big deal. And of course, talk about Venmo, 10Pay. Of course, Venmo and 10Pay can make a deal with each other. And they can say, well, we're interoperable because we have a bilateral agreement. But here's the problem with bilateral agreements. I mean, certainly you can do that. But bilateral agreements don't scale, right? If everybody has to get a bilateral agreement with everybody else, it's a mess. It just doesn't work. And the beauty of an internet-type architecture is that scales. So networks of networks scale, and it means that one network does not have to have a connection to another network in order to send value. No more than a port in Rotterdam has to have a bilateral agreement with a Walmart in Denver to send goods. It just shows up as the same shipping container, right? So shipping containers created interoperability. The internet created interoperability of data, and that's what's happening here. So that we can now take multiple hops, and you can get value between any networks without bilateral agreements. This is, by the way, why bilateral agreements in trade are not as good as trade agreements, right? So we're going backwards in some ways, but we got to move forward in others. So, but this is very important. And by the way, that first thing we mentioned about the process going from sequential to coordinated, you can't do multiple hops in a sequential system. So all these things are very necessary if we're going to get an internet of value. Okay, and then what does that mean at the end of the day? That means the fixed costs of value transfer go down to zero. This is what happened with data, and that created the fundamental change. Once that happens, now that hundredth of a penny device transaction is profitable to a bank or maybe to a new fintech startup. And what do you get? You get the same Cambrian explosion of new startups that you saw with the internet. I think that is exactly what's going to happen in the fintech world once you get this structure in place, and that is happening right now. So a very exciting time. It's really encouraging to see so many people involved in fintech here. You guys can have a huge impact on how this plays out, and I think your timing is great. So that's all I had as far as what I wanted to talk about. I'm, of course, happy to open it up for any questions anybody might have.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And as usual, please use the microphone if you have a question. I know there are plenty of questions in the room, so go for it. Please, here.
So my question is, what are some of the regulatory hurdles to achieving an interoperable network across borders? And how have you overcome that so far? And how do you continue planning to overcome that?
Yeah, so great question. So, again, the Internet of Value is going to be so different from the first Internet because you're going to have three really different domains have to work together, right? Tech, capital, and compliance. And compliance just has an outsized influence when it comes to money for obvious reasons. It's not going to change. It's just the reality. We sort of need to sort of stop fighting that and just say that's just the way it is. But I think there's a lot of good news there. Throughout the world, fintech generally and blockchain specifically has become, kind of very, very popular with policymakers. So we have a stream of policymakers coming from all over the world coming through our offices. So that's a very good dynamic. That's very different from 2 years ago. 2 years ago with the Mt. Gox collapse and some of the nonsense being spewed out by sort of these libertarian Bitcoin fanatics, which was just not helpful at all. And thankfully they've really Bitcoin community has done a great job of really adjusting. They've got lobbyists all over the world. They're well funded, much better. But you have to take it seriously. You've got to get good compliance people involved in your startups really early. I know it's a pain, it's expensive, but you just got to do it. I'd say get some connections to policymakers. Don't spend too much time in Washington. It can be a real sinkhole. So you can get in that trap as well where you're having a lot of meetings and meanwhile your competitors are getting ahead of you because you're spending too much time in Washington. Or Luxembourg or Singapore or Tokyo. Those are kind of the big fintech centers that are developing. There's a couple of things we would say have to happen. One, it would be nice if the administration, whatever administration, puts fintech on their top 15 things to think about. We didn't have that in the Obama administration, unfortunately. Hopefully we'll get that in the new administration. And what would be helpful is to get a sort of a Clinton-like framework that we had in '97. That was kind of a turning point on the internet. President Clinton signed something called the Global Framework for E-commerce. And I think that was the turning point from the internet looking like a sketchy, scary, bad thing to, no, that's a good thing. It just set a framework that all the other regulators could follow. There was another one like that in Bonn, Germany, that was also helpful in Europe. We need that. There would be an argument also, not to get too much in the weeds, but when you go node to node, if you're sending packets of information through a router that's not a recipient or a sender, you don't have any problems with copyright law. It would be nice, I don't think you have a problem really with value, but it would be nice if you had some rulings that made that ironclad. So that you're not a money transmitter if you're just a node in a multi-hop network of networks. That would be nice to have.
Yeah, please, you can just approach the microphone for those who have questions. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. It's really been awesome seeing your vision. I have actually a couple of questions. The first one is probably, so if I have you correct, ILP is to payments what IP is to the internet. And how do you actually plan to get all the different players in the network to adopt that protocol? Because you end up getting to a point where you have fiber running, you know, between, let's say, countries, but the banks are still running on copper cables. So how do you actually get them to like buy into that and actually change their networks, which are giving them a lot of revenue at this point in time? So they're making a lot of money off it. What incentivizes them to change?
Yeah, so the, two questions there, I guess. There's a number of things you can do as far as standard setting. So ILP is not something that we own, right? We've definitely contributed a ton to it, and some of our early team members actually came up with it. But it sits as a nonprofit, permissible license in an entity in Luxembourg. Luxembourg picked on purpose because that's seems to be the best jurisdiction for the Chinese, the Germans, and the Americans. And then there's kind of the key players, I think, in value transfer. Again, not to leave anybody off that list, but those would be the problem areas if somebody was unhappy. So that's important. Then working with the W3C, some of the standard setting bodies. There's a IOP working group, has about 200 members, including a lot of the big tech companies. So it feels like it's in a pretty good place. We're making, a lot of good progress is being made there on adoption. But as far as what is the bank's motivation, I think the banks have understood that cross-border payments are it's a broken system today. And if you look at, global commerce is increasing, obviously, like this. Correspondent banking, which is the way the old system worked, SWIFT and correspondent banking is the way that the system works today. It's actually decreasing. So banks are pulling back from particularly exotic corridors where there's too much regulatory burden. ILP solves all that, right? Because you don't have to have a presence in each market. Again, reach is commoditized, right? So I think banks have understood that it's a broken system, needs to be fixed, and if they don't fix it, right now I'd say banks are well positioned, but the big eight are going to eat their lunch. The big eight being, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook. They are getting in the payments, and it will take them a while because they're not regulated entities, but you can't stop that. So, but I think the banks understand that, and there's a lot of movement going on right now in 17 and getting into next year as well.
Cool. Thanks. Okay.
Just worried about security. How do you stop the crooks from sending messages on the ILP like they recently did on SWIFT, right? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So SWIFT, I think, has some fundamental problems, and I know everybody knows what SWIFT is, but it's sort of it's a bank-owned entity, and it is sort of the way that banks message each other with payments. The really important thing about SWIFT is, though, it's only the messaging layer. It's not the actual settlement layer. That's one problem. So it's kind of a decoupled process, which is a problem. The other problem is it's a closed network. So nobody knows nobody can see how it works, right? So we would argue that open source systems like ILP and like most of blockchain is open source are going to be more durable systems. Because they're open source, they're being attacked all the time. Bitcoin's being attacked all the time. Bitcoin has not broken yet. XRP or Ripple's consensus ledger is not broken. So they're being attacked all the time. I think that's a good thing. The thing about ILP that's important is it's more analogous to that shipping container, right? So if you're a sender and a receiver, your shipping container has nothing to do with somebody else's shipping container. That's really important, right? If you're on a network or a ledger, anybody who goes on that ledger affects everybody else who's on that ledger because it's a network. ILP does not hold state, right? So it's not a database, doesn't hold state. It's only relevant to the sender and the receiver who now form almost like a temporary blockchain. So that's private to those two parties. So it's not sort of out in the wilderness, if you will. Right, does that make sense? Because each ledger who's receiving it is still doing all their usual checks. If you're a weak network who's ILP enabled, you're still weak. If you're a strong network, you're fine. So all you're really trying to do there is allow those networks to exchange value.
So it's not going to solve the security problems, it's just not going to make them worse.
Well, it solves the problem on Swift being a closed system, right? This is an open system, and there's obviously scalability issues that could get bad. You know, an ILP has infinite scalability. Again, it's more analogous to a shipping container. One shipping container has nothing to do with another shipping container. I know this gets really weird really quickly. There's a bunch of white papers, by the way, on InterLedger.org, by the way, that might be helpful there.
I'll ask one if I may. I've got a microphone. You'll have to use that one. The institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, right? They spend a lot of time thinking about settlement risk and trying to contain it. Could institutions like that be helpful to you in helping adoption happen faster?
BIS could be. We've met with them. They seem more of a policy arm. So as far as standard settings, yes. So definitely we are cognizant that central banks will play a role. You're seeing a lot of really cool things coming out of the Bank of England. The Bank of Japan now has gotten frankly, I think Japan is really leaping ahead as far as innovation in this category. Fed has actually been pretty constructive. They have a lot of people working on where these technologies mean. So there's a lot of these international bodies and central banks that are part of the mix, which I think just from a credibility standpoint, it kind of gives it a little bit of a seal of approval. It's not like you have separate regulators, enforcement people, but it helps. It helps get the banks comfortable and the tech companies comfortable.
Thanks.
Again, great to be here. I know we don't have a lot of time, so what I thought I would do, I'll talk briefly about what Ripple is and what Ripple does and kind of what our mission is. But then we'll step back a little bit and give you a little bit of perspective on kind of what we see this blockchain revolution really representing, what we think the big thing is that we're trying to pay attention to and how it's going to change the world. And then I'll talk briefly about the core technologies that we're betting on given that vision that we see kind of before us. So first of all, Ripple is one of the first blockchain companies. We're about 240 employees, headquartered in San Francisco, which many of you know is a city about 3 hours north of here, maybe 4 hours. Okay, sometimes that gets a laugh. We have eight offices throughout the world, and we're growing very rapidly. We're really focused on the enterprise applications of blockchain technology and blockchain derivative technologies, specifically for cross-border payments. We think everything starts with a payment, so a lot of the use cases that we're talking about, we think they really need to have a payments solution first, and then we can really kind of grow from there. And we're really focused on how this technology can solve problems. And with cross-border payments is clearly a problem, and I think that's why we've been successful with over 100 announced production deals with enterprise companies throughout the world, and that continues to grow. So we had a record Q2, and we're just incredibly excited about the adoption that we're seeing. I should point out that these are not innovation lab deals. These are not experiments. These are full production deals where those teams had to evaluate whether or not this was going to increase my bottom line, is going to really improve the way I do business, and that's a lot harder to do. So we're really pleased with that. And again, the problem that we're trying to solve is, cross-border payments in the world they're antiquated, right? They're built on 1970s technology that just doesn't work in today's world. It's incredible that it takes 3 to 5 days to move value across the world today. You could literally put cash in a FedEx envelope, mail it to where you're trying to get to. It would be perfectly tracked. It would get there way faster. That's kind of crazy. The costs of cross-border payments are just unacceptably high, not just the fees that banks and their customers have to pay to correspondents and lifting fees, but all the capital that's tied up in the global system. Because payments are so slow, capital is just sitting there, and it's incredibly wasteful. And then most shocking of all is the failure rates of cross-border payments today. About 6% of cross-border payments fail. You're talking 1/9 of reliability. I mean, can you imagine if 6% of all your Google searches failed? we wouldn't have an internet as we know it today. So this is just unacceptable in 2018, and it's got to change. So what we have done at Ripple is we built something called RippleNet. That's really a culmination of 3 core products, which I'll talk about one of them in a little bit, but just the combination of those products, RippleNet allows enterprises, payment companies, remittance companies to enjoy on-demand, real-time payments in seconds, incredibly low cost, with, very importantly, no possibility for failures. There's atomic transactions. They can't fail in the middle. There's no settlement risk. And that gives their customers a much better experience. So the banks and their customers, they know in today's world they've got to be lightning fast, and this is really allows them to do that. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. That's a little bit about the company. Let me step back and talk a little bit about what we see this blockchain revolution really representing. Obviously, there is this is the most hyped area in technology today. This is the most attention Fintech has ever gotten, right? It's the first time Fintech has been truly global. So, clearly there's a lot of overhype. There's a lot of projects that are going to fail. I think we already know cryptocurrencies are not going to replace all fiat currencies, but they're going to be supplemental. We're not going to be buying our avocados, on IBM's blockchain, right? But it may improve some things, right? And we're not going to tokenize everything, right? We're going to tokenize things where it solves a problem, but not everything's going to be tokenized. So clearly there's a lot of hype, but you got to admit, something fundamental is happening here. I think we all feel that in our bones, right? There's something very big. You're not going to have this much money, this much talent globally that's going into this space unless something really fundamental is afoot. And the way we see it is we think this really represents the final step in globalization. And I think we all know globalization has not been very popular lately. At the same time, I think we all know there's no future for our world unless we're more global, we're more interoperating more on an international basis. We've got to fix some things. Globalization is not a bad thing. We would just say it's an incomplete thing, right? It's a work in progress. And we kind of use the example of, you can't have fire without fuel, oxygen, and heat. And we think you can't have globalization that works without a global system in 3 key things: data, goods, and money. And the truth is we only have that today in 2 of those things: data and goods. We don't have it in money. So globalization is kind of a lot of potential, but it's not really delivering yet on what it could do. We've got to complete this picture. And if you think about it, these other 2 things, they're fairly recent as well. Data and goods, we didn't always have a global system of data and goods. And think about how, I love talking about shipping containers, so let me talk about shipping containers. Think about how shipping goods was before the invention of the shipping container. Incredibly inefficient, incredibly labor intensive, huge bottleneck for the world. The dock workers could go on strike, everything shuts down. Goods would have to come into a port, they'd have to be unpacked and repacked, shipped out a completely different way. It was a mess, and this was clearly holding back the world. And then along comes this super simple technology, the shipping container, just a metal box, and boom, suddenly every port in the world, every city is interoperable to every other city. Every ship interoperates with every train and every truck, every warehouse. Totally changed the way the world works. By the way, it costs now 4 cents to move a shirt all the way across the world from, say, Vietnam, China to the US, 4 cents. That's incredible. And importantly, this was not because of the invention of a new shipping company. It was the invention of a simple standard, a simple box, a simple technology that everybody could use that was endlessly scalable and that was simple enough for people to agree on. It led to completely different shipping companies that the world has never seen before, and it led to a complete transformation of ports and the way cities operated, mostly run by robots, not by people. So it changed everything, about a 700% increase since the 1950s in global trade because of it. That's a huge win. We all know what happened with data. Sometime after the shipping container, along comes another standard, IP. Before that, of course, we had a world of different networks that didn't interoperate with each other. It was hard to communicate. It was expensive to communicate. A lot of people were cut out. And then, of course, along comes IP, a very simple standard that the whole world could get together around. and boom, now 3 billion plus people are communicating basically for free, to anybody with a single address. So totally a game changer. About 20% increase in GDP over the last 5 years because of it. Again, this was not because of a new communications company. This was because of a simple standard IP that everybody could get around, but of course led to fantastically new communication companies. We now know trillion-dollar communication companies, and completely changed the way the world works. Okay, so 2 of those are complete, but of course, money is not. Money has not had its shipping container moment. It's still stuck in the 70s or maybe before, and that is really holding back the world, right? So trillions of dollars, again, being wasted. I use the example of 4 cents to move a shirt all the way across the world. Pretty much costs nothing to send a message all the way across the world. I'll give you one example of an Airbnb host in Tanzania. He's charging $29 to a customer through that platform. By the time the money has gotten to that host, this is an actual actual example, $9. So $20 to move the value, 4 cents to move the shirt, almost nothing to move data. So obviously this has to change. And of course the implications of this lack of interoperability of money is, even all of you in this room, wealthy people, you can't send 50 euros without it all being chewed up in fees. Now, of course, there are some applications that try to, that sort of mask this, and they do a great job of it. But what they're doing, of course, without infrastructure for the whole world, is they're absorbing settlement risks. They're eating the cost. That's not scalable, right? So this has to change. And of course, the other problem with this, according to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they say that the 2 billion people in the developing world, they need to be able to send 50 cents cross-border if they're really going to be participants in the global economy. You can't do that in a system built in the 70s, SWIFT, correspondent banking. There's not enough profit in it, so banks won't engage here. There's no profit in it. And of course, we can't even get started on all the excitement that a lot of people in this room have talked about, and I think is absolutely correct, machine-to-machine payments, right? So that robots, machines are full economic actors. They may need to be able, and applications as well, they may need to be able to send 1/100th of a euro, 1,000th of an RMB. You can't do that in this system today. So this has all got to change, and I think that is what represents the excitement of blockchain. I'm saying blockchain in quotes, that is this possibly the shipping container for money? Does this complete the picture of globalization, the third kind of key leg of the stool? I would say yes and no, right? So I think right now the conversation is too much around blockchains and digital assets. I would kind of broaden this out and say what's really happening here is the creation of an internet of value. And that's going to be a little bit blockchain, so it's going to be a lot blockchains, maybe 1/3 of it. It's going to be a lot, though, about interoperability protocols, which isn't getting enough play yet. I think the industry is going to start talking a lot more about that. Just like we used to talk about AOL CompuServe, and then we switched to talk about the net. I think interoperability is going to be shifting the balance a little bit more that way. And of course, smart contracts are going to play a picture there. So it's those 3 things. But blockchains and digital assets are a core part of it as well. So let me talk about what technologies we're making a bet on. Let me talk first about which blockchain, you can probably guess which one, that we're making a bet on. So first of all, we think the key requirements for any blockchain that's going to be part of this new global system got to be open source so that it can be stress tested. Everybody can see what's going on. It's got to be decentralized, so there's no counterparty. It's got to be permissionless, so anybody can run a node, anybody can run a validator, anybody could be a miner. It's got to be reliable and secure. It's got to have a lot of history where it's worked. For payments, which again we think are the killer app, we think that's where it all starts. For payments, we think that has additional requirements. You've got to have settlement predictability. You've got to have consistent low costs. You've got to have high throughput. And we think you have to have low energy consumption. Let me talk a little bit then about how we see these and why we're betting, as you may have guessed, on the XRP ledger, and XRP is the digital asset of choice when we're talking about the blockchain component of this Internet of Value. XRP clearly has, among the majors, the lowest transaction costs. It is the fastest, about 3 seconds to settle, and it has the highest throughput of the major blockchains. Now, again, throughput, important to, I think, realize that, look, most of transactions eventually are going to be off ledger in some fashion. They're going to be using payment channels, XRP payment channels, Lightning Network, whatever it is. However, the throughput is still very important because at some point, someone's got to settle to the ledger, right? So the more throughput, the lower cost, the more efficient it's going to be. And equally as important, you've got to have this predictability of settlement. So XRP is not just the fastest of the majors, but it's actually very consistent, about 3 seconds, and the variability there is very low as compared with Ether, Bitcoin, for example, which are going to have longer close periods, but importantly also much larger variability in its close. So that randomness is problematic for payments and payment providers. The other key thing is that the blockchain will have to be deterministic. It can't be changed, right, and not probabilistic. Bitcoin is a probabilistic blockchain. So that's going to be important for payment providers as well. Energy consumption, this is actually very important. So I think as we know, Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. So does Ether today until it switches to proof of stake. So we're looking, Bitcoin, I know there's different estimates here, but using about as much as the energy of the Czech Republic today, Ether about as much as the country of Jordan. The XRP ledger, because it's using a consensus system, is using a de minimis amount of electricity. I think here with the example, it uses as much as the town of Oatman, if anybody's from here. You get a special prize, Oatman, Arizona, population 140, so a de minimis amount of electricity. Obviously, that's better for the world, right? You're not polluting as much. But very importantly, that means that you're not wasting your seigniorage on, for utility companies and for mining. It can instead go into the ecosystem, which hopefully is liquidity at the end of the day. I think liquidity is really what drives value here. So that's an important feature there. And that's why we have chosen to build products on the XRP ledger, products like XRapid, that's a component of RippleNet. That allows payment providers to lower the cost of liquidity for their global payments. So it allows, for example, a bank that's trying to send money to Mexico to use XRP as the intermediate currency. They don't necessarily have to hold XRP, but it's used to make things very efficiently. So in this example, a customer going to a remittance company in the US, those dollars now are exchanged into XRP through Bittrex, which is a great exchange. It's immediately settled in XRP in seconds. Bitso is an exchange that provides an exchange between XRP and Mexican peso. That now can be delivered to a Mexican bank, which, because they have a real-time system in Mexico, allows that to go into the customer's account very quickly. This now allows payment providers, banks, and their customers to move value in 1 to 2 minutes versus days, or a process that might mask those days but have to charge for the settlement risk and the cost. So that provides a lot of efficiency. However, that's not the complete picture, right? So let's talk now about the other components of this Internet of Value. Again, blockchains, digital assets, very, very important, has to be an efficient one. Equally as important, though, is this, again, a big problem in payments is you don't have interoperability between networks. So it's really tough to move value between either networks or countries, and that goes for blockchains as well, right? And of course, blockchains can't solve this problem, right? Because blockchains are networks themselves. As networks, they can't be a network of networks. In fact, they even make the problem worse because now there's more of them, right? So you have more networks than have interoperability. So we need some kind of an internetworking protocol for payments that is going to connect all of these various networks and can do multi-hop. You have to move away from bilateral agreements, for example. Our bet is that InterLedger Protocol is going to be the protocol of choice for interoperability. And the way this works, this is actually a derivative of blockchains. You wouldn't have had InterLedger Protocol unless there had been Bitcoin and other blockchains. And it uses cryptographic conditions so that one network can send value to another network without anybody in between. So cryptographic conditions have to be met before value can move. It settles instantly. And it can be used in any ledger. It can be used in a central, HSBC, Bank of America's ledgers, Bitcoin, a distributed ledger, anything. It can move any type of value, dollars, RMB, Bitcoin, Ether, XRP, gold, whatever. Any kind of value can be moved. It's a protocol that's been underway for many, many years. It's a completely open protocol. It's as decentralized as you can possibly get. There's a group called the WC3 that is helping with the standard around the protocol. There's almost 300 organizations that are contributors to it. So our bet is that this is going to be a successful interoperability protocol, a key component of this Internet of Value. And the way we see this is, again, we're talking a lot about blockchains, almost like we used to talk about AOL and CompuServe. But we really think the architecture here is going to look a lot like internet architecture, where you have, the networks on the bottom, all interoperating through a common IP protocol. You have the transport layers, then you have the applications. We think that's exactly how this is going to play out with this Internet of Value, where you're going to have the ledgers at the bottom, whether that be a bank's ledger, a remittance company ledger, a mobile money, blockchains, of course, all interoperating through InterLedger ILP, for example. I won't go into the transport layers, but the applications would be at the top. So we think that's a good model for how this is going to play out. But I think the conversation is going to start shifting to be a little bit more inclusive of blockchains, interoperability, and then finally, the last part, smart contracts. So big believers that also smart contracts will play a key role. Our bet would be on a technology called Codius, kind of a derivative of InterLedger. The differences here between, and so we're already getting some really good scale, the differences here between, let's say, smart contracts on Ether, which have to be on that blockchain, using that currency, using a specific language, is it's completely neutral. It can be used, again, on any blockchain. It can be used as a hosting protocol. It can use any language. It can use any currency. So we think that's going to be an important last component. We think all three of those things, the blockchains, the interoperability, and the smart contracts, equal an Internet of Value. I don't know if you want to use an analogy. I guess the blockchains are like these new fancy ports. InterLedger is like the shipping container. And I guess the smart contracts are like the robots, moving around the port, I guess, if you want to use that same analogy. And we think that this now becomes the platform for tons of other things, right? So when we're talking about lending, we're talking about securities, those really can't happen until you get the fundamentals of that payment platform, that Internet of Value completed. So I know we're just about out of time, and I do apologize. I've got to race back up to the city for another event I'm going to be super late for. But I want to thank you all for being here today.
Chris, you and I have known each other for maybe 6 or 7 years. I didn't know you at Elon or Prosper, but I did know you when Ripple was OpenCoin. And we were at a dinner in New York a few years ago that was about Fintech, a very fascinating group of people around the table. And I remember saying that of all the people there and the amazing and cool things that everybody was doing, that the one who was the most likely to change the world was you. Because Ripple has this breathtakingly ambitious view of how we should transform payments and commerce and how we live through interoperability and through new technology rails. So I want to start by just asking you to talk broadly about this vision. We've got 20 minutes. I'm hoping that everyone will get a chance to hear your most insightful thinking on where we are going, should be going, how we're going to get there.
Well, first of all, thank you for being so gracious. Very kind words, and thank you to Peter. It's great to see him again. But obviously there is a ton of noise within the blockchain space. The thing could cure every ill in the world, and the truth is 90% of it is utter nonsense that's going to go away for sure. But what comes of that, I think this is a fundamental shift in Fintech, and what we believe the big thing happening here is the development of a second internet. We call it the Internet of Value. so that value, money, assets will begin moving as quickly and efficiently as data has been moving for the last 25 years. And we think that is profound in what it's going to do to the world. So while a lot of the attention in blockchain is around new currencies, digital assets, and certainly we work on and advocate for digital assets, XRP is the one that we've really gotten behind, that's really just a subset of a much bigger thing happening. And so really I think you're leading into a world where there'll be complete interoperability between all the money systems, ledgers, networks of the world. And that's really what's missing today. So for example, we all know, wealthy people, people in developing countries, I mean, we can't even really send $50 to Europe without it being all chewed up in fees. That's clearly a problem. Much bigger problem is the 2 billion people living in the developing world who need, according to the Gates Foundation, need to be able to send 50 cents to really be participants in the global economy. You can't do that in a system that's run by SWIFT and correspondent banking, where we all know it might take 3 days to move value between countries, and where there's high failure rates and the costs are very high. So, we've been in the money world, we're living in a pre-internet world where, before we had email, it was very expensive to communicate. Imagine sending letters, nobody does that anymore. Using SWIFT is like sending a letter. When you dropped it in the mailbox, you have no idea where it is, if it got there or not. So getting away from that, I think, is profound. And what we would say is that, a lot of the backlash on globalization today, it's not because globalization is bad, it's essential. It's that it's incomplete. Because globalization needs kind of 3 key systems to be working together. And it needs interoperability and data. Check that one. We've had that since the internet IP, 25 years now. You need interoperability in goods. We've had that since the 50s with the shipping container. We've talked about shipping. We love shipping containers.
We're going to come back to that.
That was key. But you don't have it yet in money. And you need data, goods, and money to all be globally operating. And that's coming. So that's the profound thing. The neat thing about when we talk about blockchain, while it's not the digital assets themselves that can ever be the network of networks, because Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP's ledger, they're all just networks. So that can never be the network of networks. But what they did is they created this thing. We believe the winner will be ILP, the InterLedger Protocol, which we think is equivalent to IP that changed data and to that shipping container that changed goods. So that's a really profound thing that will play out over the next, pick some number, 1, 2, 5, 10 years. It's happening right now.
Take a moment and talk about the shipping container analogy, because I think it's really helpful to people. I did a podcast with Chris. My podcast show is Barefoot Innovation, which is on iTunes if you want to hear it. And you talked about the book, The Box, and the fact that the shipping container standardization changed everything about global commerce. Just take a moment to talk about that metaphor.
Sure. Again, you shouldn't get excited about shipping containers, but they're very simple things. But that kind of is the point, right? Any kind of global standard or protocol needs to be super simple and basic, super low level, because that's the only way it's going to be adopted by everyone. It's going to be adopted by Europeans, Americans, Chinese, Japanese economy. And a shipping container is super basic. A shipping container is not a shipping company. There is no way one shipping company, no matter how efficient, will dominate the world. It's going to be hundreds of shipping companies, all with different features for the Nordic countries than what you'd see in Latin America, for example. Shipping container is super basic. And why it's so profound is before the shipping container, of course, shipping goods was super labor intensive, super inefficient, like moving money is today. You'd send stuff to a port. It had to be unpacked right there at the port, repacked. It was a huge drag on global commerce. And then along comes a shipping container, so the goods stay in that container at the point of manufacturing, sent right to their local port through a truck, a train, then to a ship, back to another ship, another train, another truck, interoperable in any port around the world. And when that was created in the 1950s, 700% increase in global trade, completely transformed ports everywhere, created a Cambrian explosion of new types of shipping companies. It's exactly what you saw with the internet, by the way, and it's exactly what you're going to see with a very low level. Again, that can't be Bitcoin or Ethereum or the XRP ledger. That will be a part of what happens here. But those things are heavy, they're thick, they're shipping companies with certain features that will never be acceptable to everybody in the world. You need something super low level, something like the InterLedger Protocols, again, what we believe in, which is super basic, it's not a ledger, and just like it's not a shipping company, but something that the Chinese can get behind, you can get something in the developing world could get behind, Gates Foundation could get behind, which they have, the Americans could get behind. Very basic, very simple. And also, very importantly, if you deploy a shipping container in Los Angeles, the port of Los Angeles, it has no effect on the shipping container being used in Amsterdam or whatever the port is there. That's not true with databases. One additional entry to the Bitcoin ledger or to HSBC's ledger creates scalability issues to everything else in the system. That's why that can't work to be that network of networks.
You mentioned the Gates Foundation, and you have a project in the developing world, or focused on the developing world, called Moja Loop, which I believe Moja is the Swahili name for one. Talk a little bit about that and about the potential for this transformation to actually connect everyone in the world to mainstream commercial activity.
Yeah, we're super excited to have been able to work with and continue to work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've been incredible leaders in so many things, but also a lot of people don't know there are about 1,200 people working on financial inclusion. So kind of second to what they've been doing so amazingly with disease prevention. And they see that as a absolutely key thing that happens on Earth. And I think they share this view that sort of in the worst kind of situation right now in the world, where everybody has this, kind of amazing future and data about how great life could be on their phone. But again, until you have the interoperability of money, which we don't have yet for 2 billion people, you're tantalized by it, but you can't act on it. That's a huge problem, right? So they know that we need, this key interoperability, this very basic infrastructure layer that links M-Pesa to Bank of America to what's going on in the Japanese financial system, and you don't have that, right? That's what's blocking a key thing happening here. And I think they agreed also that you need something like the InterLedger Protocol. That's what's baked into Moja Loop, as well as many other very specific technologies that would help banks and central banks and governments in the developing world to really kind of leap ahead. One interesting thing about, I think, their view as well is a lot of people in blockchain kind of seem to talk about it's going to go around the banks, it's going to go around governments, screw all the laws. People that work in financial inclusion, they take the exact opposite rule, that the only way that you're going to have impact is if you work within the system, that it's appropriately regulated. And if you're really, people in the developing world, they want to establish, they don't want to be anonymous, they want to establish histories so they can build credit. And so that people can know who they are, so you can have trust on both sides. So it's been great working with them, and we just think they're doing fantastic work.
And people have phones. I think since 2013, there have been more people in the world with cell phones than plumbing.
Yeah.
And the World Bank has a gap that every adult in the world should have a so-called bank account in their phone by 2020. Don't think we're going to hit 2020, but we're going to hit it in the 2020s. So the technology is converging. Everybody's got the device in their hand if we can just figure out how to make the system connect them.
Yeah, we have so many of the component parts that are in place, but the cell phone represents kind of two of the components, right? It's, gives you a lot of the application layer on the top, right? Just like, Facebook and Google on the web. It gives you a lot of the databases or ledgers through the phone companies perhaps, or through banks at the bottom. But there's that missing layer of what is the IP, what is the shipping container that's going to wire them all together. And that's the part, thankfully, that's being introduced. Now when you combine then those new apps, those new devices, those new databases with an interoperability layer, boom. I mean, that changes the world overnight. And I think we're so close to that. And that will create this Cambrian explosion of some of the companies here that will suddenly have this global platform to be working on, which will make fintech so much easier. Everybody in fintech knows how difficult it is just within a country, let alone to try to go global. That is all about to change, and that's great for everybody.
And I've heard you talk about the potential then for, as you're saying, an explosion of economic development, which is why the developing world central banks and regulators are so much behind all this, because we'll have markets of billions of people who are not connected to markets today.
Yeah, it will create huge economic growth, just like that shipping container did, just like the internet connecting 3 billion people and growing, what about a 20% increase in global GDP in about 5 years? So the implications here are huge. And governments have really been getting behind this. That's what's really encouraging. You know, in 2014, it was kind of dark days for regulation in blockchain in space. Now, I think the regulators are getting behind systems that make sense, like interoperability, and getting behind digital assets. Because again, the cryptocurrencies, the digital assets, whatever you want to call them, they also play a key role in that. Once you get the plumbing in place, those new types of assets that have no counterparties create incredible efficiencies to reduce capital that has to otherwise be kept by banks all over the world. Could be used for IoT, because again, probably once you get that infrastructure in place, most payments will be machine to machine. So that also kind of, you know, again, once you solve the developing world problem, that also solves the IoT problem. So the explosion in the number of transactions is tremendous, and that drives a lot of what the demand for digital assets, which regulators are and banks are getting behind now.
So you mentioned the sort of legacy thinking and some of the early fintech of, how did you put it, screw the regulators or something like that. And of course, Bitcoin itself started on a very anti-government philosophy. And part of what Ripple has done is try to bring these innovations into a regulated framework. So I'd like to ask you, with the time we have left, to talk a little bit about regulatory issues. How are you thinking about ICOs? We have Mark Zuckerberg on the Hill today talking about privacy. Do you have advice from the policy standpoint on how these new technologies can best be regulated?
Yeah, I mean, I think all new technologies start with screw the government, disruption, tear everything down. So I think that's natural. And then, the internet started that way too, and then it has to sort of grow up. And particularly as it's solving real-world problems are always more complicated than that. And then when you switch to finance, this is different, right? This is, the internet was mostly technology, and now it's just now kind of crashing into regulatory issues. The internet of value is fundamentally tech, capital markets, and compliance, kind of in equal amounts. And if you look at the companies that are really doing things, you'll see their teams are kind of, they have big teams in all three of those. And the trick here is kind of mixing those all up together. So companies need to start from day one having chief compliance officers and compliance staffs and working with regulators and that's natural. People are going to still work through companies, whether that be banks or payment providers. They're not going to run their own banks and on their phone with nobody else no more than they run their own email servers. They use Gmail, right? So I think that's the way it's going to play out. Good news is that we are in the best fintech regulatory environment of all time. This is awesome. We know how bad it can get, right? So it's a great time. I think on some of the other things like ICOs, we're pretty anti-ICO. I think it's a bad thing to get involved with from the founder's perspective, because if you're a founder and you can raise money in many ways today, do you really want to do something where you're going to have the SEC kind of threat hanging over your head for 10 years with strict liability? You just don't want that. That's a problem. For investors, I think because companies can raise money anywhere these days, so it's a good idea. There's got to be some adverse selection if they're choosing an ICO. So I think that's a negative for the investors in these things. And then finally, from building currencies, digital assets, ICOs typically say, okay, this is a currency for this use case and none other. That's kind of the opposite of the way it should go. Currencies need to be as liquid as possible, and so they need to have as many use cases as possible. For XRP, for example, the kind of early beachhead has been cross-border payments, but we see that as just the beginning of something that really has a multitude of use cases to get as liquid as possible. That's what drives utility and value at the end of the day. So I think on all fronts, ICOs are problematic, and that's why you're seeing the regulators crack down on them Not everywhere, but I think they'll be transformed. They'll probably look like, IPOs at the end of the day. Privacy thing, lastly, I think just no question, we are in a market failure on privacy. And when you have market failures, government has to step in and regulate. I think that's going to happen. I think the state of privacy is, it's in a bad place right now and needs new rules. It can't be done through self-regulation. That's already failed, just like it did back in the day when we were doing privacy around banks. So I suspect you're going to see new laws come out. There's a very good California proposition called the California Consumer Privacy Act, which will get the signatures. That will be on the ballot in November, and that really goes to the heart of some of the egregious things that are going on, I think, in kind of collecting all this data of ours without giving us choice. So I think that is coming, and we should all be prepared for more privacy regulation.
Do you have a view on the European privacy and consumer data efforts? They've been more forward-leaning than we have been here.
Europeans have been great. They've been way ahead of the curve here. They're exactly right, and Americans have been super flip. And Silicon Valley has done a pathetic job on privacy, just dismissing it out of hand, all the famous quotes we've heard. So Americans are way behind. We got to do a lot more.
Maybe the last thing I want to ask you is to sum up. So we have a group of here, we're early in the conference. People are going to be deluged with thoughts and information and ideas. If you wanted the people in the audience to remember one thing from this session that you hope they'll take back and put to use, what would that be?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing we think is super exciting that we're on the cusp of an internet of value. So that's going to play out in a way that's very good for all of us. And I think a lot of that will be headquartered right here in the Valley. That's going to provide a ton of new business opportunities. The other thing that I'd say, I always tell, because I made this mistake early on, is like we all start these businesses based on what we see, which is usually consumer. Look at enterprise. Enterprise, the consumer is like on the surface of the water, and there's this huge thing under, kind of under the surface for enterprise. Fantastic opportunities. So don't ignore enterprise, even if it's not in front of you.
We've talked before about once you have digital currency, which can work in micro payment denominations of any denomination. I think one of the things you've talked about is we could be doing things like putting sensors on systems that can generate income streams, unlike anything we have today.
No, I think once we have an internet of value layered on top of the internet of data, data and money are going to be moving together in little packets of information, and not just in digital assets, but in fiat currencies. That's really, really exciting. That will change models. Devices become the biggest consumers of payments, for example, and they're doing searches on Google. How does a device, take in an ad? So that's going to change things there too. But very, very exciting what's coming.
Do you feel the vibes?